So we left off last week at the end of chapter 28, meaning that we're up to chapter 29. Give you a little heads up, it's a heavy-duty chapter. It's a lengthy chapter, number one, but beyond it being lengthy in terms of page numbers, it's also some pretty heavy material. So I'm going to try and finish this chapter today because there's no class next week, and I'd rather get it all done in 1 week. So I'm going to kind of move through it as quickly as I can. But if you have any questions along the way, feel free not to ask me any questions. No.
What is it before?
Page, no, it's fine. Page 324. 324, chapter 29. Spiritual insensitivity, a tough conversation you need to have with yourself. This is like being, brutally honest. So as Tanya explained at length, every person is capable of becoming a Benini. That's a person who achieving self-mastery in the areas of thought, speech, and action. But what the Benini cannot necessarily sustain is enthusiasm for what he's doing. Enthusiasm is especially necessary in two areas: A, prayer, which is the service of the heart, and B, delaying gratification for permissible activities. We kind of discussed that last week, the week before, where just because it's permitted doesn't mean you have to do it. When a person denies himself even things which are permitted, it helps to build up essentially your discipline. So if you're disciplined in doing things that you're allowed to do, it makes it easier to be disciplined and not do things you're not supposed to do. Now it's straight to the text, page 324. However, there's one other key area in which aspiring or actual Beinanim need to, quote, take counsel from your souls. When periodically and frequently your heart is desensitized, in Hebrew called timtum alev, to spirituality as if it were a stone, and you can't find any way to emotionally connect with prayer, which is the service of the heart. Let's just make a bracha, by the way, on your food. If you're having sushi, we'll do a blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'achol ya bidbaro. All right, there you go. And so also you're sometimes unable to put up a fight against evil inclination, to sanctify yourself through that which is permissible to you, to delay gratification and possibly abstain from permissible activities due to a sluggishness in your heart. So as anybody well knows, at times, let's say, okay, I don't want to do what's wrong. I want to beat my evil inclination. It's just not happening, though. It's so difficult that I've tried. I've put up a bit of a fight, but it's like, a losing battle. So what do I do? In such a case, the following prescribed plan from the book of Isaiah is cited in the Holy Zohar, what the head of the heavenly yeshiva said. Page 220, I'm sorry, 325. So this is where it gets interesting. It says a wooden beam won't ignite and give out its light. You crush it and will ignite it. Basically, if you're making a campfire and you have a large log, it doesn't want to light. It's very hard to light a full log. So what you do is you break it, you splinter it, basically. That's what it means, like break it into pieces. You splinter it physically, it's much easier to ignite the wood, smaller pieces. So if a body won't give out light, the light of its soul, you crush it, so to speak, and the soul's light will come out. What does that mean? It doesn't sound like a good thing. You want to crush yourself? That's not usually recommended mode of therapy for most, right? So what is the Alter Rebbe getting at? Hey, Rosh, Neher Dishmasa, Shar Nasham V'Sechei Nemeir Kol Kach Lim Shal Chum Yishib Beguf, Av Shemim B'Spenim B'Sichos Blus Av Shem, and Nitfas and Nivek Berechel Kol Kach Shuch Lim Shal Al Chum Yisalev Machmas Chum Yusam V'Gasusa. The meaning of the Zohar's phrase, a body won't give out the light of its soul, is that your soul and your intelligence won't shine their light sufficiently to curb your body's sensuous urges. And though your mind does appreciate the greatness of God and meditates on it, your mind still fails to grasp and absorb God's greatness to the extent that it could curb your heart's sensuous urges because of the sensuality and vulgarity of both your mind and heart. In other words, he's going to explain it a little more in depth later on, that innately, every one of us has this great level of light of God within ourselves. The problem is that light doesn't seem to manifest itself through our body 24/7, because if it did, I'd never sin. And yet most people are not quite there yet. We are tempted to sin, right? Etc. So what happens? How do I, in a sort of elicit, how do I get this light that already exists somewhere within myself out so it affects the rest of my body? As he'll explain it shortly, but that's the idea of crushing it. In a sense, crushing the body means to remove the coarseness of the body, to thus enable what already exists, that existent light to come forth and illuminate the rest of the body, and thus be able to serve God properly. He'll explain it more in more words than I just. Despite your efforts of meditation, you don't have a spiritual awakening due to the vulgarity of the klipa in your heart and mind. That's the shell, sort of, that's inhibiting the godliness from coming forth. Which exerts itself over the divine soul's holy light, hiding and blocking its light from illuminating the rest of the soul. So as we learn, it says in chapter 19, the chachma in your divine soul is a permanent window to God, which can never be obscured. Remember, we talked about chachma, which is literally means wisdom. Okay, but that level of wisdom in the soul is always there. There's no way it can be obscured. It's going to be there for all eternity. We're on page 325 on chapter 29, if you have a book. But what klipa can do is block chachma's energizing influence on the rest of the soul, its light, so that the chachma itself remains trapped and exiled. Advice teaches you how to cause that light, which is already present in your soul, to shine into your mind and heart. So that's the idea, that the light's already there. Every one of us inherently has this light within ourselves, that chachma of God, but it's trapped. How do you get something out that's trapped? You often have to break its way out. This is the idea of breaking the body. Not physically, obviously, but on a more spiritual level. It means breaking, yeah, but it's also basically breaking your tendencies. We talk about breaking a habit. What does it mean to break a habit? How do you break a habit? I mean, okay, so you have a bad habit, so if I decide not to do it anymore, I'm technically breaking my habitual behavior. So in essence, this is breaking the body, which may otherwise have been habituated to temptations, vulgarities, so on and so forth, and breaking it to ensure now that the inherent godly light that's in me is now able to come forth. But he's going to explain. So that's why the Zohar advises that you ought to metaphorically crush the body and raise it to the ground, which means practically that you ought to schedule ego deflating. This is what it's about, page 326. Ego deflating sessions, so that your body's sensuality and vulgarity becomes, in the words of scripture, disgusting in your eyes and repulsive. In other words, that the person looks at their own behaviors, the bodily sort of desires, as ones which are vulgar and repulsive. That's the breaking we're talking about. It's not a matter of someone else telling you, oh, you've acted in a very, depraved way. Did you recognize within yourself, this doesn't behoove who I really am? It's like, I'm sure it's happened to everybody at some point in life where you question, how in the world did I do that? Why did I do that? That was not a good decision, right? You don't remember that part, but nonetheless, it could have happened in someone's life, right? But and then one looks at themselves afterwards like, how can I stoop so low to do A, B, C, or D? Right? So this is in a sense the mindset we're talking about, but not just once, on a consistent basis at auspicious times in a day, not just throughout the entire day where you walk around feeling like a beaten up shmata. But again, we spoke about it earlier, and he'll discuss it again in this chapter. It's more germane to like specific times in the day, in particular before you go to bed at night, saying the Shema, so on and so forth. Where you get that sort of, get it out, you sort of shed yourself of that whole ugliness, and then you know Hashem forgave you, and you move on. Have a good night's sleep. Pleasant dreams. Cheers. Okay. Next, section 2. Belay, Larry, I hope this battery doesn't, I got 15%. I might have to plug in the iPad. I'm down to 15%. We'll see if that'll last me another 50 minutes. Belay, Nishba, Ruach, Nishbara. And as we learned above, the Zohar's insight on Psalms, this is chapter 51 of Psalms. A heart that is broken leads to a broken spirit, meaning that a heart is broken, dismantles the negative energy field that surrounds you, which is caused by sinning. A broken negative spirit, and this negative energy is the Sitra Achra. So Sitra Achra is that which opposes the opposite of godliness. So anything in essence that counteracts godliness, that is contrary to God, to what God wants us to do, is essentially come from the Sitra Achra and creating negative energy. So this is not yin and yang, it's a little different than the Chinese philosophy of different energy levels in the body. But in essence, you want to have this positive energy and negative energy. In this case, positive energy is coming from a godly side, negative energy coming from the side of sin, of impurity, of evil. So where did this negative energy field come from, if not from sin? And why is the session of introspection directed at the person and not as negative energy? In other words, why am I directing it at the person, or in this case, it's me that did this sin? Why don't I direct it at the actual energy, the negative energy? I'm okay. It's the negative energy I have to get rid of, right? You would think maybe they're not part and parcel with each other. There's the negative energy, and then there's me. Me, I'm a tzaddik. You know what I'm saying? I'm God's gift to mankind. I can do no wrong. Ask my mother, right? Okay? Actually, don't ask my mother. But negative energy, that, okay, I can do away with. And that's what I should fight. But we're not talking about destroying the negative energy. We're talking about breaking the self, me, myself. So why is that? Because in the case of the Beinanim, the negative energy of Sitra Achra is identified with the actual person himself. It's not just some sort of secondary thing, like an appendage. It is the person. People who sin acquire a negative energy field as a result of their behavior. But in a less pronounced way, the Beinani, this is the man, remember, the Beinani is the one who doesn't even sin, but still it has temptation. The Beinani has a pre-existing negative energy built into his system at birth. What is that? Since the energizing animal soul, which gives life to the body, remains in its innate strength as it was at birth. So in the Beinani's heart, So the negative energy field is not something acquired, it's an integral part of the person himself. Basically, you're born with it. We're all born with it, frankly speaking, as long as you're alive and kicking. So, because remember, we discussed how your godly soul could care less whether you eat, drink, sleep, take care of any of your physical needs. It's your animal soul that does that. And your godly soul, in essence, is manifest within your animal soul. So that, for example, when I eat, we discussed this last week, but when I eat, why am I eating? So eating is a necessity of the animal soul, not of the godly soul. But the godly soul wants me to eat so that I'm better able to serve God. The animal soul doesn't care anything about serving God. It wants me to eat because I'm a glutton, because I'm a drunkard, because I love chocolate cake, or whatever it may be. Follow? So that's the difference. So by directing the spirit-breaking power of remorse and introspection towards his actual self, the Beinani can shatter the inner negative energy field that is preventing his mind and heart from being enthusiastic about worship. However, this leaves us with another question, further question. Have we not learned that a person who has not one but two selves? Remember we said, if you, let's say, just what was this talking about? Like, for example, during davening, for argument's sake, let's assume that you're a super Jew and you're focused and you're feeling really godly and what have you, and then you finish davening and it's back to the old me, full of sin, wanting to sin, etc. It's like a dual personality. So you might think then my whole davening is worthless. I was all this holy moly, whatever it may be. I was really in this spiritual rapture going on for a while, and that was great during davening. I finished davening. It's like Jekyll and Hyde. I'm one person during davening. I'm the next person after davening. Maybe my davening was worthless. So that would be true if you only had one soul that went back and forth. But we have two souls. We have the godly soul and the animal soul. So the godly soul wants one thing, that was davening. The animal soul wants a whole different thing, and that's my desires thereafter. So that's what he's referring to over here. Have we not learned that a person has but not one but two souls, or two selves, divine and an animal? So why then does the Tanya associate the self here only with the animal side? Why isn't the self also the godly side? Is that not one of my selves? If I have two selves, then there's a godly self, and an animal self. So here we're only talking about the animal self. What happened to the other one? Well, Nefesh, top of page 327. And regarding the divine soul, we say, the divine soul which you placed in me is pure. It's part of the morning davening. So we say that every morning to God. The divine soul that you placed in me is pure. The text is precise in stating that the divine soul was placed in me. It doesn't say it was sort of like became a part of me, was created with me, meaning that there's me, implying that you yourself are not the pure divine soul, because there's you, and then God placed the divine soul into you. So it's two different things. Follow? So now,
He also placed the animal soul. He created
so
the animal.
so true, but nonetheless, actually, it doesn't say that regarding the animal soul. The animal soul actually was given to you at birth. It's part of your DNA when you were born. The godly soul comes in actually in stages. It doesn't come in all together. The animal soul is there the moment you're created. You have an animal soul, right? A godly soul comes in literally in stages. For a boy, it starts, part of it is bris, and then it's bar mitzvah. For a girl, it says they get it earlier, like when they're named, and as well as their bat mitzvah. But that's when it comes in full-fledged. The animal soul's been there all that time, the entire time since your existence.
That's true. You see that in little children.
Well, they're all angels. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know what you're referring to. So while it's true you have two souls, you only have one self. There's just one person with two souls. The self being whichever consciousness represents your core identity. Beinanim and Rishonim, the wicked and sort of the intermediate, still identify primarily with their bodies and animal souls, and they see the divine soul as an influence more than an identity. It's like my divine soul is influencing me, but it's not who I am. I'm still me. God put that divine soul in me to help me make the right decisions. But there's still me. I'm still an entity. And that's why the ego deflating sessions for Beinanim can be directed simply at the self. Since by default, this will target the body and animal soul, because that's really what the self is. But you'll see as we get through. Except in the case of tzaddikim. These are the absolutely righteous people for whom it is the other way around. And the pure soul, the divine soul, is the self for them. Unlike us, or everyone else who's not a tzaddik, there's the self, and then there's the divine soul. In the case of the absolute tzaddik, the divine soul is the self. The tzaddik's body is just his flesh, something that belongs to him. It does not constitute his core identity. The tzaddik's primary frame of reference is his divine soul. This is interesting. He sees when we see in the language used by the famous Hillel, the elder. Okay, he's quoted extensively, like, don't do unto others what you don't want to do unto yourself. So Hillel the elder said to his disciples that when going to eat, he used to say he was going to perform an act of kindness to a poor, miserable creature, referring to his body. It's like, I'm doing my body a favor, the poor, miserable creature, by going to eat. Why? Because he, as a complete tzaddik, had no interest in eating, but he had a body that had to be fed, right? So the terminology he used was that the body, which is almost like a stranger to me, but although it's me, because my godly soul needs a place to be vested in, but my whole focus in life is my godly soul. And that was the case of Hillel, not with the vast majority of the world. But the way he put it was, I'm going to do some kindness with this, this poor, despicable thing that needs some help. So therefore, I'm going to feed it, essentially. Because it was like a stranger to him, in the sense that it was not his core identity, and that's why he would say that in feeding it, he was doing an act of kindness towards the body. Because his self was identified exclusively with the divine soul, unlike the case of the Beinani, the one who's a mixture, sort of the intermediate, as well as the Rasha, the wicked person. Okay, earlier in chapter 28, we learned that the divine soul cannot influence the body directly, but does so through the medium of the animal soul. I just mentioned it before in the class. Into which it must dress, page 328. Into which it must dress. How then is it possible for the tzaddik to identify exclusively with his divine soul? If your divine soul can only operate really through the animal soul in the body, and with everybody, so then why doesn't the tzaddik also identify with the body? Why is Hillel making a statement like I'm doing a favor to the stranger, my body, by feeding it? Because in the case of the tzaddik, his body and flesh are energized by the divine soul alone. Since the evil within his energizing animal soul, dressed in his flesh and blood, has been transformed to good completely. And in the case of tzaddikim, the transformed animal soul has been completely absorbed into the divine animal's holiness, divine soul's holiness. So the animal soul, in the blood and flesh still remains the access point for the body, even in a tzaddik, because again, that's what prompts the tzaddik to eat his body alive. Nevertheless, the tzaddik's animal soul ceases to have an identity of its own. Since it has been utterly transformed to good, it has now become absorbed and incorporated into the structure of the divine soul. So that's only in the case of the tzaddik. But the focus of the book of Tanya, in particular, this chapter, is not for the tzaddik. It's for the Beinoni and all the future Beinonim. But in the case of the Beinoni, since his energizing animal soul, dressed in his flesh and blood, has a deep core of Sitra Achra, which hasn't been transformed to good, that constitutes the Beinoni's actual identity. And this being the case, and his identity, the Beinoni, is as far from God as can be, which sounds to be pretty drastic. Here's the guy, the Beinoni, who doesn't sin. He's still tempted, still has an animal soul, but controls himself completely. And yet we say, because his identity in reality is not the divine soul, his identity is more the animal soul, and the divine soul is dressed or manifest within the animal soul. So he puts it that he's as far from God as can be. That's pretty sobering. Where does that leave us?
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Really fun.
Right. So that's not the point. The Alter Rebbe is not to give us like, a zinger and say, have a good day. Liadvar masurin, for even though the Beinoni has achieved total mastery over his external garments, his animal soul's appetite has not been fundamentally transformed at its deep core, and he's fully capable of craving for things forbidden by the Torah that violate God's will. So even though practically speaking, the Beinoni is very close to God, he doesn't sin. He always overcomes his temptation, even though he still has temptations, but he stops him dead in the tracks. But that same Beinoni, we're saying, is still as far as can be from God. Even if he doesn't desire to actually do forbidden acts, God forbid. It's not like, the Beinoni, for example, let's say another person, we might have a desire to do something wrong, a forbidden act. Okay, might even thought about it, but then I stop myself. The Beinoni doesn't sit and ponder it for 10 minutes, sort of enjoying himself in these forbidden thoughts. He stops them dead in their tracks. It wasn't even a remote thought to actually transgress and do them. But still, he says, so what's the difference if that's the case between the Beinoni and the tzaddik? The tzaddik also doesn't do anything wrong. They don't sin. The difference is that the tzaddik, the Beinoni rather, doesn't have utter despise for evil. The tzaddik looks at anything which is evil, in other words, contrary to what God wants, with absolute disgust. It's just disgusting to that tzaddik. The Beinoni doesn't have that same level of disgust or despise towards evil like that of the tzaddik. He doesn't sin. It's a tremendous amount of control, but it's one thing to say, okay, I'm not going to do this. Let's say this is the evil thing. It's not coffee, okay? Maybe it should be scotch, but nonetheless, let's say this is the evil thing, and I could just say, okay, I'm not going to do this. I see it. It's here. It's accessible. I'm not going to do it. But do I hate it? Do I despise it? Not really. I want it. I'm just not going to do it because I know I shouldn't do it. The tzaddik despises it with the utmost level of despise. Well, the Beinoni does not. So on that level, as we explained above in chapter 12, so that so long that as you are not repulsed by evil, the Sitra Achra, the sign of evil, still has a hold on your animal soul. In this respect, or on page 329, that his core personality is still drawn to acts that violate God's will. Here's another sobering thought. Since in respect to his core personality, he's still drawn to do things that he shouldn't, even though he doesn't do them. He's inferior to non-kosher animals, more disgusting than insects, and more repulsive than reptiles, as mentioned above in chapter 24. What did we learn there? That a man who sins is inferior to the Sitra Achra itself, as well as to the all species powered by the Sitra Achra, such as non-kosher animals, insects, and reptiles. This is because ultimately the Sitra Achra was created by God and does its allotted task, unlike man who chooses to violate the divine will. In other words, the Sitra Achra is only doing what it was created to do. It's to try and trip us up. So it doesn't have a choice. And frankly speaking, any non-kosher creation, animal, reptile, what have you, is a non-kosher creation. They didn't choose one thing or the other. We, on the other hand, have freedom of choice. And when we choose to do something contrary to what God wants us to do, we're lower spiritually than even the lowest of low of creations. Here, the Tanya takes the argument a stage further. And it is not only sinful activity which makes a person lower than klipa, but even the desire coupled with the ability to do so. So that's like, okay, that's oof. It's one thing, I hold myself back and don't do it, but not to have any desire to do it. So he says, as the verse states, I am a worm and not a man, as it says in Psalms. And my desired behavior, and therefore I am the shame of humanity and the disgrace of a nation. King David. Okay. But as we have learned, there is at least one time when the Beinoni feels a passionate love for God, like the tzaddik, and that it is during intense prayer. Right? That's when the Beinoni goes into this great spiritual, mode of service. Perhaps then the Beinoni could be considered close to God, as he temporarily identifies with the divine soul. So Tanya dismisses this theory. Why? Page 330. V'gam kishemizgaberes by nafshay halakis leir avalavai b'shas tefila eni be'em samit legamri mach shechalevas ve'veres machat tefila v'keniskal sefer gimel. And even when the Beinoni's divine soul gains strength during prayer, arousing a passionate love for God, while this love is considered authentic, it is not absolutely authentic in a perfect sense. Why? Since it dissipates and goes away after prayer, as mentioned earlier in chapter 13. So the fact that the love dissipates shows that it was not absolutely genuine and did not represent an elimination of klipa from the core personality of the Beinoni. In other words, that the core personality of the Beinoni didn't change. In the case of the tzaddik, it's completely transformed. In the case of the Beinoni, the core personality remains, still having temptation, albeit controls the temptation. Everybody still breathing? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ignorant question, but I'm a little lost in the sense that isn't that kind of the point of humans? I mean, we're humans. We're not going to be except the rare person.
True.
There, it almost sounds like it's. I'm trying to get to where it's going, but like it's condemning you for having that.
So it starts with the condemnation part here. We're not done. It's not all bad news. Okay. I told you it's a little heavy. The beginning, yeah, I got you. It's heavy, but there's hope, and there's a lot of good company. Okay. Midway down 330. Yes, and God knows we're human. Yes, he's laying all the groundwork for why, and in a sense, you say, okay, I'm supposed to be brokenhearted every day or night, whatever. That's for some amount of time, so then I can do teshuvah, repent appropriately. Well, how do I create brokenheartedness within me? That's just like flip on a switch. Oh, I feel brokenhearted. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so this is getting you into that frame of mind as to where it comes from. There's a genuine reason to feel brokenhearted. Again, during the appropriate times, not all day, every day, to get a person into the teshuvah, the repentance mode, and then to be able to serve God properly. That's what this is all about, not just telling us how great we are. Okay? Yeah. Well, this is just in case you have in case one in their mind has no ego to contend with. We talk about the ego deflating. This is ego deflation. Methodology for ego deflation. Some people need more deflation, some people less. Well, the above ego deflating sessions will be especially powerful when you recall how your soul is contaminated from the sins of youth, as it says in Psalms, referring to seminal emission. For the Beinoni, these sins of youth are something from the past, for which he's already repented. Nevertheless, the Tanya offers the Beinoni two humbling thoughts. One, and firstly, the damage that was caused in the upper worlds by the sins of youth still persists. Since why? Because we already did teshuvah, repented. Why they still exist? Since there in the upper worlds, time poses no limits. This past, present, and future is all one. And in the absence of time to distinguish one day from the next, it is as if you had actually defiled yourself and caused this damage today, God forbid. Now, okay, so he says this argument will apply equally to any sin, but Tanya stresses sins of youth in particular, since, as we've learned earlier, the spiritual damage is great. So that seems to imply that, okay, I sinned, I did teshuvah, I repented, I should be forgiven now. Now you're telling me that it's not really forgiven because, there's no time in above. So even though I did it 20 years ago, I never did it since. It's like it happened today. Because with God today, yesterday, tomorrow, it's all one thing. Even though you've since repented acceptably for this sin, nevertheless, as we shall see, there's still something lacking. Why? So repentance is an experience on two levels. On the practical side, it is the decision never to commit a particular sin again. It's called charat al-avar, that I have remorse, that I'm not going to do it again. On the emotional side, it is a feeling of remorse over what you've done. So one is accepting upon yourself not to do it again. The other one is be remorseful. I feel badly that I did it. It's two steps to teshuvah. So as long as you make a sincere, practical commitment not to do it again, then your teshuvah is acceptable and you're forgiven. But as Tanya will now explain, the emotional component of teshuvah is ongoing and can take place on many levels. In other words, this feeling, the remorseful feeling, is not just like remorse, one and done, I'm finished. Follow? So resolving not to do it again is one and done. So assuming you never do it again. But feeling remorse is not all remorses are created equally, okay? Some people have a little bit of remorse within the same person. They can be more remorseful, less remorseful, tomorrow even more remorseful, the next day not at all remorseful, etc. Page 331. The most important element of teshuvah is its emotional component. And emotions can be experienced across a very wide range. All depending on the individual circumstances and on the time and place as intelligent people realize. So you constantly mature through life. In other words, the teshuvah you may have done 30 years ago was apropos to 30 years ago when whatever age you were at the time, whatever level of maturity you were. But now you're older, more mature, more understanding. So that level of teshuvah doesn't work for you anymore. That emotional remorse is not the same. Now it should be much stronger. I have a better understanding of what kind of damage, if you will, I may have done than I did when I was 15 years old, or whatever it may be. So therefore now at this time in your life, long after your teshuvah, so he says, therefore, now at this time in your life, long after your teshuvah, when you see for yourself that you are spiritually desensitized and your body won't give out the light of its soul, there's something blocking this godly light from emanating in my soul. The implication is that while your teshuvah may have been sufficient in the past for your personal standing and circumstances, today, the emotional component of your prior teshuvah is unacceptable. And today, your prior sins are separating you from God, resulting in the spiritual desensitization. Or the other possibility is that while your past teshuvah remains acceptable, God wants to lift you to a higher level of teshuvah. There's different levels of teshuvah. You can do a basic level of teshuvah, the VIP package level of teshuvah, a higher level, etc. Which means by upgrading the emotional component so that it's from deeper within the heart. And that's why King David said, and my sin is always before me. Remember, this chapter 51 is the same one that speaks about the brokenheartedness, etc., the bitterness. And it mentions over there that King David, who incidentally became a complete tzaddik, he rid himself of his evil inclination by profuse fasting. But if you read the book of Psalms, it's almost like a biography, much of it of his struggles, okay, until he got to this point. But even so, he says, but yet my sins are always in front of me. So page.
This is so true. I've never seen this written before, but I felt.
I didn't make it up. It's all in the good book. Page 332. The impact of neutral activities. Even if you are clean from serious sins of youth, commit in your heart to fulfill the Holy Zohar's teaching to be an expert accountant. This is like doing your accounting at night, right? The introspection we spoke about. The Zohar states that each night before going to bed, a person must take account of the actions he did that day, repent for them, and ask for compassion for them. And people who do this are called, quote, expert accountants. Namely, you should make a personal account of all your thoughts, spoken words, and actions that have transpired and come to pass from the day you were born until today, and ask yourself, were they all from a context of holiness, or were some from an impure context. May God protect us. Protect us. So the definition of an impure context being even all those ostensibly neutral thoughts, spoken words, and actions, which, while we're not religiously forbidden, we're not consciously directed towards God to fulfill His will or in His worship. This is the meaning of the word sitra achra, the other side, meaning anything which is not the holy side, as we learn in chapter 6. So even if you're not guilty of major sins, did you have thoughts, spoken words, or actions which were not consciously dedicated to God? If you did, then these activities had the energy of sitra or negative energy. Just like an actual sin, a further humbling thought for an ego deflating session. In case your ego was not deflated enough, here's a little extra bonus for you. Mudazah is page 333. And this thing is known. He called at any moment when you think holy thoughts, you become at that time a chariot for the holy chambers in heaven from which the thought flowed. And conversely, whenever you think impure thoughts, you become at that time an impure chariot for the impure chambers from which all bad thoughts flow. And the same thing applies to the same thing is true with holy and impure speech and action. Now we get to section 5, the meaning of your dreams. Here's another little zinger for you. As a further source of your humbling thoughts, take to heart that the content of your dreams in the majority of cases are vacuous, meaning that they're empty, and a strain to the spirit. They're full of foolishness usually. Why? Because your soul is unable to ascend to heaven properly. If your soul successfully reached the heavens when you were sleeping, your dreams would have a holy and pure content. Empty or negative dream content suggests that your soul was unable to ascend to heaven. As the verse states, who shall go up on the mount of God? Who shall stand up in his holy place, the clean of hands and the pure of heart? So only the pure are admitted to heaven, the mount of God. So the rejection of your soul from there during sleep suggests that you are not of clean hands and pure of heart. Page 334. So what can you expect to dream when your soul is not admitted to heaven? What are they going to be like? So he says, and when the soul fails to enter the heaven chambers or the heaven during sleep, these evil aspects come and cling to him, informing him of worldly matters, some false and some true. And sometimes they toy with him, show him falsehoods, tormenting him in his dream, etc. Which goes to Vayikra, as stated in the Zohar portion of Vayikra, etc. See there at length. So if a person is having unpleasant dreams and the like, well, by and large, our dreams are a reflection of what we thought about during the day. So if you're thinking about holiness all day long, then your dreams are going to be holy by extension. If your head is filled with frivolity, whatever shagas going on, then more often than not, the dreams will be a reflection of something that happened during that day itself. Even though most of our dreams are filled with stupidity, like the impossible happens in our dream. Ironically, you can't die in your own dream. You ever notice that? You know, you have dreams that you're falling, you wake up before you hit the ground. Why? If the dream's not true anyway, it's just a dream. It's interesting. You think about it, people don't die in their own dreams. They wake up right before that's going to happen. I can't explain to you why. That's above my pay grade for today. But it's just an interesting thing. I figured I'd throw that out there. But by and large, most of our dreams are not filled with the heavenly revelations, unless one really put themselves forward throughout the day to warrant that to happen. So now the more time you will spend on these ideas, both in personal reflection and through studying sacred books on these topics, to render yourself heartbroken inside, and in the words of scripture, disgusting in your eyes and repulsive, utterly repulsive, so that you are completely repulsed by your life. You thereby repulse and degrade the sitra achra, the opposite side of holiness, with which yourself is identified. Must be a law for you cast it down to the ground, humiliating it from its grandiosity and its inflated ego and its arrogance. And that is what led it to exert itself over your divine soul's holy power of Chachma and block its light, causing you to become spiritually desensitized. So this is, in essence, when we talk about breaking the body, this is the breaking we're talking about. You want to break, it's basically self-deflating the ego, so that I will allow that what otherwise innate godly light that's in me anyway, to be able to shine forth throughout the rest of my body. Section 6, bottom of 334. And in addition to being repulsed at your animal soul, you should also employ a further technique of encouraging your divine soul to become enraged with your animal soul with a thunderous voice of anger in your head to humble the Sitra Achra, as it says in Ezekiel. As our sages of blessed memory taught. A person should always make his impulse to good angry at his impulse to evil. As the verse states, get angry and don't sin. Psalms and also from the Talmud. So, meaning to say, get angry with your animal soul, meaning your impulse to evil, with a thunderous voice of anger in your head, and say to it, you are bad, disgusting, repulsive, and wretched, etc., along with all the use of the impulse to evil. Say to your animal soul, for how much longer will you hide before the blessed infinite light? Now Tanya offers a brief meditation on the nature of God's infinite light. How do we get into that frame of mind? An infinite light of God that floods all the worlds, all the spiritual worlds, and is devoid of any limitations, such that simultaneously he was, he is, and he will be, all at once. Even in this very place where I stand, right here, the infinite light shines, and his infinite light remains alone, just as it was before the world was created, since there's no existence independent from this light. And since there's no new independent existence, the infinite light has experienced no actual change. Says the verse states, for I, God, have not changed, since God transcends time, etc. Meaning that even after God created the entire world and created all the cosmos and all the human beings and also the Sitra Achra, everything, still in all, God has not changed an iota. Nothing's changed, even though God's here right now, like he was 5,785 years ago. And still nothing's changed within God himself. This is, in a sense, getting us into a more humbled frame of mind. So the enraged conversation with your animal soul continues, saying, on page 336, but you, wretched one, deny the self-evident truth, and that in his presence everything is considered zero, which is as obvious as it were seen visibly. So why do we say this idea of seeing it visibly? We'll explain in a minute. What are the results we can hope for when following the above advice? Through this, you will help the eyes of your divine soul to be enlightened by the non-dual reality of God's infinite light. It's just one light, it's not dual, with the clarity and certainty normally associated with actual sensory vision. But without the uncertainty, which inevitably comes through using deduction and logic alone, which is far, this is the root of all worship. Basically, that means that when you see something, it makes an indelible impression upon you that someone will have an extremely difficult time to convince you otherwise. I saw it. But on the other hand, if you heard something or you try to understand something and somebody is good enough at sort of, spinning your mind or spinning whatever it is, you might say, okay, maybe I didn't hear it that way. Maybe I misheard, or maybe I misunderstood. Ever happen? But if I saw it with my eyes, you can tell me I didn't see it. Who's the crazy one here, me or you? Okay. So the division that we're talking about is that we want to see the godliness as a level of sight. It becomes so powerful, it's undeniable. And thus, in a sense, this brings about this contrite feeling, this self-deflation, if you will, of the ego, because I'm in such greatness Such awesome holiness. This God that created the world thousands of years ago has not changed an iota. And he's right here in front of me. So that, in a sense, helps to set the tone within our own heads when we get into this frame of mind. We're not done yet. And a little more ego deflation.
This is a how-to.
This is very much a how-to. I told you it's kind of a heavy chapter, but I'm aspiring to finish it, and hopefully before the battery runs. I got 4% left, Larry. We're good.
Oh my goodness.
All right.
I'll forgive you if I don't.
Section 7. We're working on it. Ego deflation brings you closer to God. The reason why these conversations with the animal soul are effective is because in reality, the Sitra Achra has no substance at all. So this is the good news. Now we start with the good news. Then in reality, the evil really has no substance to it at all. The Sitra Achra can only conceal the truth, but it has no real power. Once its lie is exposed, its allure is neutralized. It loses all of its luster. And that's why Sitra Achra is compared to darkness. Since darkness has no substance at all and will be effortlessly banished by light. It's not like darkness is something. It's just, well, today, for all intents and purposes, the absence of light. I walk in, I turn on a light or light a match, the darkness dispels, tremendous amount of darkness is dispelled by a little bit of light. And while the Sitra Achra seems to have considerable substance, since it has a lot of energy with which it animates all the non-kosher animals, as well as the animal souls of the wicked nations of the world and the animal souls of Israel, Nishkalel, as mentioned above. Nevertheless, despite this apparent abundance of substance in reality, its energizing power is not autonomous, God forbid, but rather its power is derived indirectly from the powers of holiness, as mentioned in chapter 6 and 22. And that's why, being inherently devoid of substance, the Sitra Achra is eliminated completely by the presence of holiness. It's like the light that's going into the dark room, just as physical darkness is eliminated by physical light. But if the Sitra Achra is so devoid of substance and power, why is it so difficult to overcome it in our daily lives? If it's nothing, really, it doesn't have power of its own, it's just obscuring the godliness, so why is it so hard to get rid of it? Why can't I just turn on the light, quote unquote, and make it light, get rid of the darkness? Only in the case of your divine soul's holy power of Chachma, God granted special permission to the Sitra Achra of the animal soul to have the ability to exert itself against the divine soul, so that you will be inspired to overcome it. And bring down the Sitra Achra of your animal soul through the above meditations of self-debasement and ego deflation, becoming disgusting in your eyes and repulsive, as it says in Psalms. And if you do this, God will help you, since with an awakening from below, there's an awakening from above. To fulfill the verse said of the Sitra Achra, if you lift yourself high like an eagle, from there I will bring you down, says God. So you put your best foot forward, and then God will make sure to make it work. So how exactly will God bring the Sitra Achra down? How's he going to get rid of the evil? Namely, he will take the Sitra Achra's power and ability away, page 338. Because by stripping it of the ability and permission it was given to exert itself over the divine soul's holy power of Chachma, and then, stripped of its power, it will be effortlessly banished and eliminated, just as physical darkness is eliminated by physical light. So God, since it's not a substance, okay, but the Sitra Achra seems to be extremely powerful, but in reality, it's not. It's a lot of it's a figment that we have up here. It conceals the godliness, but if we're able to, in a sense, get rid of that, it's like turning the dark room into light. So then all of a sudden the light illuminates all over the place. Now, obviously, it's not easy. It takes breaking the body, viewing the temptations, the body is repulsive, vulgar, so on and so forth. Now the last part, a story of ego deflation. By Shekazov, So here we find an idea clearly in the Torah concerning the spies sent to scout the land of Canaan. Who initially said, we are unable to go up against this people, for they are stronger than us, so we can't conquer the land. So the Talmud says, do not read stronger than us, but rather stronger than God. Suggesting that they didn't believe in God's power to help them conquer the land. They weren't asked to give an opinion whether it's conquerable or not. They were supposed to come back with a report, like what's going on there. Not to ask their opinion, do you think God's going to be able to conquer the land? But afterwards, they retracted their position and said, we're ready to go to the place of God that God spoke about. So all of a sudden, how did they regain their belief in God's power? If initially first they were questioning God's power, that it lands to these giants, whatever the problems are, and why all of a sudden, okay, not a problem, we changed our mind. I mean, they don't work in Congress or in the government. We just change your mind when it's not convenient, okay? So he says, Hooray, leher lahem, Moshe Rabbeinu Hashem Shom Aisu Mevis Alzer Ben Tayim. Moses of blessed memory had not showed them any miraculous sign or wonder in their interim period. All he said to them was that God had become angry with them and had sworn not to bring them to the land. But of what persuasive power was this divine anger? If they didn't believe in God's power, heaven forbid, to help them conquer the 31 kings that occupied the lands, and what difference does it make if they're not going to go into the land anyway? Like, okay, God's mad at me, well, we're not going anyway. I mean, I didn't believe that God could take us in from the get-go. So what changed? Just because God's angry? If I don't believe in God, then what does it matter if he's angry? Or if I don't believe in God's abilities? So he says, this being the reason why they didn't want to go into the land, this being the reason they didn't want to go into the land in the first place. So where they suddenly acquire faith, which shortly beforehand seemed to be completely lacking. Nothing positive had happened to inspire them. It's not like Moses gave them some great pep talk. Folks, come on, guys, spies, you got to get yourselves together. Come on, you got to strengthen your belief in God. Nothing like that. He did tell them, by the way, he's pretty upset, okay? And he's just not going to take you there. You got really angry. Somehow that seemed to flip the switch for them. Why? Rather, we can be certain that they didn't need to acquire faith. They already had the faith. Why? Since Jews are inherently believers, the children of believers. It's part of our spiritual DNA. Rather, it is only that the Sitra Achra found in their bodies exerted itself over the divine soul's holy life. As a result of the Sitra Achra's inflated ego, arrogance, and irrational chutzpah. Hubris, as we call it in English. And therefore, as soon as God became angry with them and was enraged with a thunderous voice, as it says in Ezekiel, where God says, how much longer must I bear this evil congregation? Your corpses will fall in the desert. I, God, have spoken. I will do this to the entire evil congregation, etc. Their hearts were humbled and broken inside them, hearing these harsh words. And the verse states, and the people mourned greatly. And as a result, the Sitra Achra fell from its power, its arrogance, and its inflated ego. So in other words, they already had the belief in them. But it got convoluted, it got, clouded. What did God do? Well, God obviously gave them a thunderous, I'm angry. And that right away reignited the extant belief that they had in God in them. Just like, in a sense, with us, we have that extant chachma that exists within ourselves. Problem is, it gets convoluted, it gets clouded. So every so often, we need to give a good zetz, so to speak, to the body to remind it that it's nothing but this vile, vulgar, whatever the story may be, that's full of temptation and Sitra Achra. Break that, in a sense, concealment, to allow the godly within ourselves to thus shine forth. That's what it's talking about, the crushing, yes. So the people didn't acquire faith through some inspirational event. Rather, their inherent faith surfaced due to a negative event, which was God's anger, which dismantled the Sitra Achra and was blocking their faith. And the Jewish people are inherently believers. The Sitra Achra acted only as a superficial blockage to their faith. Page 340. So from this, we can all learn a lesson that when doubtful thoughts about faith pop into your head, which happens to many people, remember, they're just words emanating from the Sitra Achra, from the side of unholiness, which has exerted itself over your divine soul. But Jews are inherently believers, the children of believers. And here's the interesting part. What is more, remember that the Sitra Achra itself, the opposite side of holiness itself, is a servant of God and believes in God without any doubts at all. It has only been given or granted permission by God to confuse you with lies and deception, so that your reward for resisting its allure will be greater. In this respect, the Sitra Achra is like a harlot who, with the permission of the king, tries to seduce the king's son with lies and deception, as it states in the Holy Zohar. Basically, that example brought down in the Zohar is that the king hires the harlot to tempt the son to see his integrity. In reality, the harlot doesn't really want the son to sin. It's the prince, okay? But she's hired to do what she's supposed to do. So in essence, the same thing with the Sitra Achra. It's hired, so to speak, or created to do what it's supposed to do, which is to confuse us, to conflate things, so on and so forth. But deep down, it wants us to be able to overcome it. That's what it really wants. And this is, in a sense, I know I ran through this chapter really quickly, but it was an easy chapter, and we actually finished it, and I have 2% left of battery left on this. Not bad. I started at 14. So we had a thought.
Yeah.
I'm gonna finish my coffee.
They had this Neshama inside in the Holy Soul, and they after Hashem was angry with them. They felt the anger. They felt the remorse. Maybe they understood, but they needed the 40 years to really, for him to really hear them. Like you need the time to deepen.
But they didn't even make it to the 40 years. All those
make it to the 40 years, but they had 40 years to feel a deeper remorse.
Okay, so well, the problem, I understand where you're going with it, but the 40 years was basically a punishment for having doubted God's word, etc.
Yes.
And it says that the generation of the desert, with some exceptions, didn't make it out of the desert. They died. That generation died in the desert. It was only the next generation made it into the land of Israel. So their remorse happened almost immediately when they heard that God got upset. It just evoked within them the innate belief that they already had anyway. The problem is that their belief, got a little, verschmutzigt.
They didn't understand. They didn't see.
Well, it became convoluted. That's what the Sitra Achra does. Listen, when anybody has some doubt in what God does, listen, not everybody understands God's ways on a daily basis. Frankly speaking, more often than not, we don't understand why God does what he does. And to many of us, it doesn't resonate. It's like, why would God do this? Why would God allow this? The whys continue, okay? So, and for many people, they say, if that's the God, then I don't want such a God. Okay? So the old famous story. I remember how the joke goes. I don't know. I can't remember the details. But bottom line is, the kid comes home from the Hebrew school, telling his mother about God and God and God and whatever. And the father, after hearing this whole speech, says, and by the way, we don't believe whatever, something you're not believing in God. He said, but God did this, but that's the God I don't believe in. Sort of like he knows there's God. I'll give you a better example. This was a non-uncommon sentiment. Actually, I heard it's from a Holocaust survivor who Nebuch had suffered horrible atrocities, okay, and seen horrible things during the Holocaust. And obviously gave up his belief, as was the case for many people, gave up his belief in God, his practice and the like. And I think it was his grandson or so a generation or two later that also was not believing, what have you. And the grandfather gave him up to why don't you do? Why aren't you observing? Why don't you believe? He said, because you don't believe. Look what God did. He said, my not believing in God or my not observing is because of what God did. I just can't bring myself to do it. But you have absolutely no excuse. This is the Holocaust survivor berating generations later. In your case, you absolutely have to believe. You absolutely have to observe. Only someone like that can say it to someone like to the next generation, 2 generations later. But it's true. So even though many of them themselves were no longer observant or religious, what have you, but they still they might have been angry at God, which is understandable. But you have to believe in God to be angry at God, because otherwise, what are you angry at? If you don't believe in God, then it's happenstance, random, blame it on anything you want. So that's what it boils down to. So they do believe in God. They're angry at God, fine. They don't agree with God, fine.
My mother said something when her mother died. She lost her mother. But she must have believed in God to be angry at him.
Well, otherwise, what are you angry at?
But
If you don't believe in God in general, there's no reason to be angry about anything. You just say it's a numbers game. Yeah, whatever, circumstances. So what are you angry at? Things happen,
But I understand what you're saying, because they never had a chance to go into the promised land. But maybe when their journeys in the desert, their understanding was deepened, and their crying out was deeper, and that brought some light into their life, a better life. It doesn't say in the Torah.
It doesn't.
But perhaps
they lived a different life. All said and done, this battery might die in a second. So if we cut out Larry, it's nothing against you. Okay, but you can keep listening. They lived almost an idyllic life in the desert. They didn't have to worry about food. The money came from heaven. They didn't have to worry about drink. They had water from the Miriam's well. They didn't have to pay some obscene amount of water for a bottle of water, like we do in the airport for $6 for what? I don't know. Okay, it was free. Okay, and their kid and their clothing, it says, miraculously grew with them. They didn't have to go shopping for clothes. There was no Amazon deliveries and whatnot. So basically, all their physical needs were taken care of. They had the clouds of glory around them that protected them from the heat, from the cold, from the scorpions, from the snakes. Everything was great. So they had a reluctance at that point to leave that behind, which was actually part of what the issue, the Chassidus explains the spy's perspective from a whole different level. It didn't, according to Chassidus, it wasn't they didn't believe in God. Of course they believed in God. The issue was that they believed that it was better for the Jews to remain in the desert and had this great godly experience of studying Torah, uninhibited, without any physical worries. They go into the land of Israel, they're going to have to plant, they're going to have to sow and reap and work the land. You're not going to have the same amount of time to go and serve God like you do today. That was truly what their mistake is, based on the way Chassidus explained.
That wasn't what I was saying.
No, I understand that you're saying too, over the time, perhaps their perspective would change. They needed time for remorse.
When the remorse deepens, that's when the light comes in, and
It's
your
true.
life is better. So I'm thinking, I'm maybe just kind of fantasizing that they weren't in the same place. The remorse deepened, and they spiritually they had more light in their life. They were more advanced.
They did, but this was specific to the spies themselves. It wasn't to the whole nation of Israel. We're talking about here with the spies.
But the people also,
Larry, there's no class next week. Just to remind you, okay? No, these. Larry, just to remind you, got it. No class next week. Okay. If I don't see, I'm gonna. This is about to die. So have a good Shabbos, Larry. We'll be in touch. I'm literally down to like